Snow fell in small, patient flakes and settled on the uneven stones of the street. A single lantern burned over the door of a workshop and cast a circle of amber on the snow. The rest of the alley was blue and quiet. The hour was late. The city had folded itself into narrow rooms and banked fires. Only a few figures moved, wrapped in cloaks that turned with the wind. She sat against the wall where the doorway gave a little shelter. A shawl covered her hair. The shawl had taken the color of ash from many winters. In her arms, two small children leaned into her side, their faces pressed into the wool. Their hands were tucked in. They did not cry. They watched the snow the way one watches a thought pass by. Her breath rose and joined the night air. It did not leave a mark. Beside her, on the stone, lay 3 small coins. The coins made a thin, pale sound when the wind turned them against each other. She did not look at them. Her eyes stayed on the lantern. She counted each slow sway as the flame moved within the glass. At the far end of the street, a step sounded. It was not a hurried step. It had the weight of a person who knows where he is and knows the ground beneath him. The step drew closer and then paused. A figure stood where the shadow of the workshop roof met the light from the lantern. Snow patterned the fur lining of his cloak. A chain lay across his chest. The metal was dull with cold. He looked at the woman and the children. He did not speak. He lifted a hand a little, as if to ask the night for silence rather than the people before him. The woman turned her face toward him. She did not shift the children. She did not lift a hand to guard the coins. The coins were not the center of the night. The children were. The cold was. The space between two people was. The man moved closer and the snow changed sound beneath his boots. He stopped at a careful distance and took off a glove. His ungloved hand was open. It did not demand. It offered. He kept it there without hurry. The flame inside the lantern drew a thin line of light along his knuckles. The woman watched the hand as if it were a road. A road is only a path until someone takes it. 2 women stood farther back in the lane and watched. They wore plain dresses and shawls. Their faces held the quiet of people who have seen much and learned to speak little. A boy passed behind them carrying a bundle of kindling. He looked once and then lowered his eyes. The street kept its slow breath. The man spoke first. His voice was low and even. He said that the wind would rise before morning. He said that the river would bring the cold deeper into the streets. He said that his house was near. He said that there was a fire and bread and a place to sit. He did not say his name. He did not ask for hers. He did not say why he had come by this way at this hour. He kept his hand open. The woman listened. The children listened without meaning to. A small hand opened within the fold of the shawl and closed again. The woman asked if he was alone. He said he was not. He said that there were servants who would bring water and that there was a room where no one would ask questions. He said that the door could be closed from within. The woman looked at the coins. She looked at the lantern. She looked at the snow. None of these things changed. She turned her eyes to the faces behind the man, to the 2 women near the wall. One of the women gave the smallest nod. It was not a command. It was a shared knowledge of winter and rooms and the time a child can spend in the cold. The nod was a bridge that could hold a single step. The man lowered his hand and then lifted it again. It had not been refused. It had been measured against the night and found likely. He took one more step and crouched so his eyes were level with the children. He said that the floor near the fire was warm. He said that the sound of the fire was like a small river that never left its bed. He said that sleep would come. He said that the door would close. The older child raised his head. He looked at the man with the slow care of someone who has learned to watch. He did not speak. He did not smile. He looked at the hand. Then he looked at his mother. She drew him closer. She pressed her cheek to his hair. She made a decision inside the quiet she carried. She asked the man if he was expected somewhere else. He said that the night expected everyone to find a place, and that for now this was the place he needed to be. His words were simple. They did not ask for trust. They offered its shape. From a window above them, a curtain moved. A face looked down and then withdrew. The city was a net of eyes and doors. It did not forget what it saw. It did not remember with kindness or with anger. It remembered the way stone remembers steps. Each mark was a mark. The man knew this. He did not look up. He unfastened the clasp of his cloak. He set the cloak across his arm and held it out. The fur edge caught snow and held it. The woman watched the cloak. It was heavy and well made. It could hold the night off for a little while. She shifted the children and wrapped the cloak around them both. The weight of it steadied their breathing. The man did not reach to adjust the clasp. He let the woman do this. The shape of grace is sometimes the shape of restraint. They rose together. The woman lifted the smaller child, and the older one stood with the help of her arm. The man did not touch them. He moved to one side and made a clear path. The children stood within the circle of the cloak, like two candles within a single glass. The snow softened the sound of their steps as they shifted their weight. The two women at the wall turned a little to watch them pass. One of them drew her shawl closer. The other looked at the coins on the stone and then away. The coins were not nothing. They were also not enough. The boy with the bundle of kindling had already gone. They began to walk. The man kept to the side where he could meet any figure that might come down the lane. He did not walk in front, and he did not walk behind. He matched the woman's step in the reach of the shorter legs beside her. The lantern's circle fell away, and the dark grew more open. Snow lay on the shoulders of the houses like a thin sheet laid over sleeping forms. As they passed the corner, a breeze funneled through the streets. The children leaned into their mother in the cloak. The man shifted his arm so the fur broke the wind. A shutter knocked gently somewhere above. A dog gave a single note and then slept again. The city kept its winter promises. The woman asked the man if the road would climb. He said no. He said that the river had cut the streets into a bowl and that his door was near the lower edge. He said that the door had a mark of ivy carved into the wood. He said that it was easy to miss if one did not know. They came to a wider street. A cart stood there with its wheels wrapped in cloth against the noise. A line of narrow houses faced the square. In one window, a candle still burned. The flame moved with the draft and drew a thin letter against the glass. The letter had no name. It was only the shape of a wish. The man paused at a corner where a small shrine stood. A figure in stone held a lamp above a doorway. Snow had gathered along the figure's shoulders. The man bowed his head a little. The woman stood without moving. The children watched the lamp. The lamp did not burn. It held a small crust of snow at its edge and looked like a cup turned to the sky. A patrol passed at the far end of the square. Their steps were even. Their cloaks were heavy. The man waited until they had gone. He did not wish to answer questions. He did not wish to give names. He wished to bring two children and a woman to a place where the door could close. They crossed the square. Their steps left a set of shallow prints that would be filled soon. The city did not keep tracks long in weather like this. The man led them into a narrower lane where the wind could not find them. The lane bent once and then again. A small arch overhead carried a sleeping balcony between two houses. From beneath the arch came the smell of baking. The smell was faint and steady. It made the children lift their heads. The man stopped before a door of dark wood. The door had a small carving at eye level. Ivy leaves curled around a single bird. Snow rested in the shallow cuts. He reached into his coat and brought out a key. He said that the house was quiet at night. He said that no one would ask their names before morning. He said that a fire had been laid on the hearth, even if it had lowered now. He said that there was wool and bread. He did not open the door at once. He looked at the woman and waited. She studied the carving, the step, the lintel, the place where light would fall if the door opened. She studied the man's face for a change in intention. She did not see any. She saw care. She saw the kind of caution that knows how a small promise can break if handled without patience. She gave a single nod. The man turned the key. The lock moved with a soft, deep sound. He pushed the door and stood aside. Warm air touched their faces. It carried the smell of ash, of old wood, of wool hung to dry, of bread. The woman stepped through the doorway, and the children stepped with her. The man followed and closed the door. Inside, the entry was dim. A candle burned in a glass at the foot of the stairs. A second door stood open to the left. It led to a room where the glow of a banked fire made a low red on the hearth. The woman stood at the threshold and looked carefully. The room was modest and orderly. A cradle stood near the wall with a folded cover over it. It held no child. A chair had a shawl on the back. A bowl on the table held dried apples. The sight of ordinary things in a warm light can feel like a tide that lifts a boat from a rock. The man set his gloves on the table and moved to the hearth. He laid 2 small sticks on the coals and blew once, twice. Flame rose with a soft sound. He did not look back while he tended it. He gave the room time to say that it would not harm them. He placed a kettle on the iron arm and set bread near the edge of the hearth to warm. The woman unwrapped the cloak from the children and set it across a chair. The children went to the fire and held their hands to it. The older one stood behind the younger, so the warmth met him first. The woman watched this and let a small breath go from her chest. There are words that do not need a voice. They live in the weight of a shoulder that lowers by a finger's width. The man brought a small stool to the hearth and set it for the younger child. He stood a little apart and let the heat rise to his hands. He said that winter could make a person feel very far from themselves. He said that heat gives a way back. He spoke without looking for an answer. From the stair, a light step sounded and then paused. A maid stood there with a shawl over her nightdress. She looked at the woman and the children and then at the man. He said that they were guests and that water would be needed. The maid nodded and went toward the back room. The sound of a bucket lifting from a shelf and a lid set down came in a neat line. The man asked if the children would take milk with honey. The woman said yes. She said that they had eaten little today. The man said that the bread would be ready soon. He set a cup where the child on the stool could see it and wait without fear that it would be removed. Trust grows in places like this. It grows in the distance between a cup and a hand that does not snatch it away. The fire gathered itself and the room filled with a steady warmth. The woman loosened the edge of her shawl and let the heat find her neck. She looked around the room once more. The cradle, the shawl on the chair, the bowl of apples, the polished irons near the hearth, the simple painting over the mantle of a river in autumn. She asked if the house had belonged to his family for long. He said that it had. He said that names move through houses the way seasons move through trees. He did not say more. The maid returned with water and a folded cloth. She set them on a small table and left the door to the back ajar so that light from the kitchen could reach them. The man poured hot water and added a leaf of herb. He broke the bread and gave the smaller piece to the younger child without asking for thanks. He placed the larger piece near the woman and the older child so they could share it as they wished. He said that there was more. The clock in the hall marked the late hour. The sound was round and calm. The street outside went on with its winter, but inside the lines of the room grew gentle and clear. It is a simple thing to draw a chair near a fire. It is a simple thing to set bread on a plate. It is not a simple thing to change the course of a night. Yet sometimes the shape of a night turns with a single open hand. The woman looked at the man and said that she would tell him their names when the morning came. She said that she would tell him how they came to the cold street when the children were asleep. The man bowed his head. He said that the night could hold a little more silence. He said that the fire would hold until dawn. He moved a log with the iron and watched the sparks lift and fall. The children ate. Sleep began to pull at their eyes. The younger one's head leaned to the side. The older set a hand on the small shoulder and kept it there. The woman rose and asked if there was a corner where they might rest. The man said yes. He said there was a small room beyond the kitchen with a bed made and an extra blanket at the foot. He said that the door closed well. They crossed the room in a slow line. The man lifted the candle in its glass and held it so their steps could see. The woman carried the younger child. The older walked with her, one hand on her skirt. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. The man stood in the firelight with his hand lowered and his head turned a little, as if listening to a distant sound. Snow tapped once at the window. Then the house went quiet again. The room beyond the kitchen was small and clean. A bed with a plain coverlet stood against the wall. A chest held folded linen. A basin sat on a stand with a pitcher beside it. The woman set the younger child on the bed and helped the older climb beside him. She drew the blanket up and smoothed it over their backs. The children turned toward each other and slept in the same breath. She stood for a time and watched them. Then she sat at the foot of the bed and let her hands rest in her lap. Her eyes closed and opened again. The house spoke in small sounds. The kettle shifted. The log settled. A door hinge sighed. She felt the warmth along her forearms where the shawl had fallen open. At last she rose and went to the doorway. The man waited in the main room with 2 cups on the table. He looked at her and did not ask. She crossed the floor and sat. She touched the rim of the cup with one finger. She said that the street where he had found them had not always been a place of cold for her. She said that she had once crossed it with a basket and a song. She said that the winter had taken both. He listened. He did not lean forward. He let the space between them be even. She did not yet tell him her name. She said that morning would have enough words. For this hour, the fire and the sleeping children were the only words that mattered. He agreed. He said that sometimes a night is strong when it has almost no language. They sat in the warm room while the city lay under its sheet of snow. The lantern outside burned through the last of its oil. The coins on the stone shifted once and were still. The tracks in the square filled. The patrol passed again and did not pause. A baker turned in his sleep and would rise before long. The river carried its cold under dark arches and did not lift its voice. In the house the fire held, the cups cooled. The woman's shoulders lowered by another finger's width. The man watched the embers. He thought of doors and of names and of how a single night can place a hand on the hinge of a life without pushing it open. He thought of the way the children had stood in the cloak together and how their breathing had settled at the same time. When the hour grew later, he rose and drew the inner bolt on the front door. He banked the fire with care so it would wake at dawn with a little coaxing. He set a folded blanket near the chair in case she wished to rest there before going to the small room. He did these things without saying that he did them. He did them the way one sets a table before anyone is hungry. The woman thanked him with a look that did not ask to be seen. He inclined his head. He said that morning would come. He said that there would be light enough for names then. He lifted the candle and moved toward the stairs. His shadow rose along the wall for a moment and then was gone. She sat a little longer and listened to the house breathe. Snow fell. The city rested. The fire kept its low red. The children slept in a room that had a door, and the night, which had begun with ash and cold stone, now held a steady heat that did not ask for anything in return. The street would remember the image it held for a moment: a woman with 2 children, a man in a fur cloak, a hand open in the snow, the lantern's soft circle, the coins that were not enough. The watchers who said nothing and understood. In years to come, a person could pass that place and feel a small change in the air without knowing why. The city keeps such notes. This was the beginning, though no one would have used that word. It was only a door that closed. It was only a fire that settled. It was only a shawl that warmed and a cloak that waited on a chair. It was only the sound of snow on a window. It was only 2 people who had not yet said their names to each other and 2 children who had fallen asleep at the same time. That was all the night asked to hold, and it held it well. Morning opened with a thin band of light across the floorboards. The house held its quiet the way a hand holds water, letting only a little sound slip through. In the small room beyond the kitchen, the children slept close, their breasts making a soft rhythm under the blanket. She rose carefully, drew her shawl over her hair, and stood for a moment to feel the warmth that had settled in the walls overnight. In the main room, the fire had lowered to a bed of embers. He was already awake. The cloak that had carried them through the snow lay across the back of a chair. Steam rose from a pot on the trivet. He greeted her with a nod. Words still seemed like guests that had not yet taken off their coats. He poured hot water over leaves and pushed a cup toward her. The cup warmed her hands and steadied the faint tremor that nights on stone can leave in the fingers. She sat where she could see the door to the little room. He took the second chair but kept a space between them, as if leaving room for the rest of the night to finish its story. Outside, a cart rolled by with its wheels wrapped in cloth. A bell sounded far off. The city gathered itself for market. He asked if the children had slept. She said yes. He asked if she would eat. She said later after them. Then she lifted her eyes and began to speak. She said the shawl had belonged to her mother. That was why it kept the color of ash and not of soot. It had covered many winters and many doors. She had lived above a cooper's shop 2 streets away. Her husband's hands had known the weight of green wood and the patience of lines drawn around a barrel to make it sound and true. The river rose one spring and spoiled the stock. Trade shifted. Debts pressed like a slow hand on the chest. He left to look for work where the ships were larger. The letter he promised to send did not come. She did not use the words grief or loss. She said only that the room grew small when rents grew large, and that winter can make a corner feel like the center of the world. She took in washing, then sewing, then mending of small seams that paid in coins and crusts. She kept the children away from the river in thaw and away from the alleys when the taverns emptied. She learned the hours of the patrol and the places where a lantern burned late. She learned how long a child can bear the corner wind before the face goes gray. He listened with his hands folded, his elbows resting light on the table. He did not interrupt to shape her account. When she paused, he asked if there was anyone she wished him to send word to. She shook her head. The few names that had once been doors were now walls. The children entered then, hair flattened on one side from sleep. The older led the younger, holding the cloak around both of them, the way a small boat holds to a shore. She wrapped them near the hearth, and he set out bread and warmed milk with honey. He broke the loaf without measuring and gave the first pieces to the children. He cut cheese with the careful motions of a person who has learned that steadiness keeps fear away. While they ate, he stepped to a small chest and brought out a roll of linen, a needle case, and a ledger. He set them on the table but did not push them toward her. He said there was work in the house if she wished to do it. The household kept simple accounts for wood, flour, candles, and coal. There were shirts to be mended and a curtain whose hem had let go. He said there would be coin for it, not favor. She watched the ledger as if it were a window. Numbers lined the page in a clean hand. The lines steadied her. She asked if he often brought strangers home from the snow. He said no. He said that the city makes a person hard if they let it, and that some days he did not wish to let it. He did not tell her more of himself. She noticed the faint mark on his sleeve where a signet chain sometimes rested. She noticed a small painting over the mantle of a river bend in autumn, and in the corner the initials of a painter whose name had begun to be spoken at the market stalls. The maid entered with kindling and a basin. She nodded to the children, then to their mother, then to him. Her face held the practical kindness of someone who knows what many winters have asked. She said the baker across the lane had fresh loaves and that the street had drifted snow near the arch. He thanked her. When she left, the older child followed her with his eyes and then looked back to the bread, as if remembering to return to the day he was in. After the children were fed, he brought a small copper tub from the back and set it near the hearth. He went upstairs to fetch a folded bundle and returned with 2 small shirts and stockings, worn but clean. He said they would serve until she could decide what should be done next. She wanted to refuse the shirts, Pride rose, then settled. She brushed the children's hair with her fingers and nodded once. When the water warmed, the younger child laughed at the steam. The sound carried like a thread through the room and cut a small door in the heaviness that had followed them in from the street. She looked at the man and found his eyes soften for a moment. It was not pity. It was something that recognized a line between harm and safety and wished to keep it where it was. He said he would go to the market for flour and coal. He asked if there was anything she would prefer. She said soap and a needle of a finer size. If it was not trouble, he said it was not. He put on his coat and paused at the door. He said the inner bolt would hold and that the maid was in the kitchen if she needed anything. He left without asking for her name. When the door closed, she sat at the table with the ledger. She ran her finger along the columns. The numbers told a small story of days regular and steady, a cart of wood in early frost, a sack of flour before the feast, candles counted, coal weighed, a note about a broken hinge. She found the place where the hand had paused during the last entry. She completed the line to the margin in the same script. She let the ink dry. The act felt like standing on a deck that does not move. The children played with a row of wooden buttons on the floor. She threaded her needle and examined the curtain hem. The cloth was good and plain, the tier clean. She worked in short stitches that would hold but not draw the eye. As she sewed, she thought of the door of the cooper's shop, of the way her husband had turned his hat in his hands when the last commission failed, of the small bruise the basket left on her shoulder during the last auction day when she carried shirts to the square and brought back almost nothing. Noise from the street rose and fell with the morning. A seller called apples. A cart rattled faster than was kind to its axle. A dog barked once and then forgot its reason. Somewhere a church bell marked the next hour. The house breathed with the city but at a distance, as if a river ran between them and made a low sound that steadied the banks. He returned before noon with a sack of flour, a wrapped bundle, and a small bar of soap. He set them on the table and opened the paper to reveal 2 needles and a twist of thread the color of wheat. He did not say what each thing cost. He only pushed the ledger toward her and asked her to write it in. She did so, and the numbers entered the day like careful guess. The maid brought in a pot of barley soup and set 4 bowls. They ate without words of thanks, not because thanks were not felt, but because the room itself seemed to be saying them. Between spoonfuls, he asked if the children had a way of keeping time. She said that the older knew the bells and the younger knew hunger and sleep. He asked if there was a thing that would make this house feel less strange. She looked at the shawl and said a peg by the door, where it could hang, would be enough for now. He rose and set a peg into the frame before the soup cooled. When the bowls were cleared, he said the weather would turn again by nightfall. He suggested they walk to the inner courtyard, where the snow lay clean and shallow, so the children could see the sky without the wind cutting their faces. She hesitated, then agreed. In the courtyard, the air held the smell of laundry soap from a high line, and the snow shone without glare. The younger child traced a path with a stick. The older found a patch of wall, warm from sun, and leaned against it with his eyes half closed. She stood beside the man and kept her gaze on the children. She said she would not stay if the house asked for anything beyond work already named. He said the house asked for nothing more. He said if she wished to leave when the thaw came, he would give her the coin earned and a note to the baker who needed a steady hand at the till. She said a note was a thing that could be weighed. He said that was why he offered it. A shadow crossed the arch. A neighbor peered in and then went on. News travels by such glances. He met her look. He did not flinch. Reputation in a city is a fabric that can be mended or torn by hands seen and unseen. He seemed to understand that the cloth had already been marked and that care, not haste, would keep it sound. Before they went back inside, the older child asked if the cloak could stay near the fire. The boy said the fur smelled like the street, and the street made his chest feel tight. The man said yes. He lifted the cloak and set it on the chair that held the morning. The fur warmed in the light and lost its snow. Afternoon settled. She finished the hem, set her neat line of stitches, and tied off the thread. She hung the curtain and stepped back. The room brightened by a fingertip's breadth. He noticed and said nothing, which was a kind of praise that did not weigh the air. As evening drew near, he lit the first lantern. She washed the cups and set them to dry. The children drowsed near the hearth. He asked finally for her name, not as a payment for shelter, but the way one asks for a word that will help the rest of the story stand up straight. She gave it. Then she asked for his. They spoke them once and let them settle. Names do not solve a winter. They simply make a place where two people can stand and look at the same door. Snow began again as the light thinned. The city tightened its cloak. Inside, the house learned the measure of 4 voices breathing in a single room. The shawl hung on its peg. The ledger lay open to a clean page. The night ahead waited without demand. It would be enough to keep the fire, count the candles, and listen for the change in the wind. The market square was alive with the low hum of trade when he stepped out the next morning. Snow had been cleared from the center, packed high along the edges like white walls that framed the business of the day. He walked with the even pace of someone who knew the weight of his presence and let it do its work. A few merchants nodded. Others watched him with the quick measure of eyes that counted coin as much as courtesy. His cloak was the same one he had worn that night. The fur collar held a sheen where the snow had melted and dried. The chain across his chest caught the light briefly as he turned toward a stall selling salt fish. The vendor spoke a greeting that carried a trace of deference. He answered in the same steady voice he had used with her. No rise, no fall, just enough warmth to keep the air from feeling like stone. In the house, she finished sweeping the main room, the children watching from the hearth. She had taken the ledger down again, checking figures she had not yet memorized. Numbers had their own kind of comfort. They stayed where they were put. She paused only when the younger child asked if the man would return before the bells. She said yes, though she did not know. He passed a row of stalls selling cloth and leather, stopping once to examine a bolt of wool. His hand ran over the weave. The merchant began to speak of its strength against winter winds. He nodded but did not buy. He was not here for cloth. He was here for news. Near the fountain, 2 men in long coats were speaking in the half-privacy that markets allow. He greeted them by name, received the same in return. Their talk was of coal prices, the ice on the river, a shipment delayed upriver. Then, as often happens when voices turn low, it was of people. Someone had seen him turn into the narrow lane by the shrine 2 nights ago. Someone else had heard that a woman and 2 children now sat by his fire. He did not deny it. He said only that a door can be opened for a night without changing the house. One of the men smiled without humor. The other shifted his stance as if marking the ground. They spoke no more of it, but the exchange had already set its small roots. News like water finds its way through any stone. When he returned, the air in the house felt different to him, though nothing had changed in the furniture or the light. The children had moved closer to the hearth, and she was mending the sleeve of one of the shirts he had given them. She glanced up, not startled, but aware, the kind of awareness that comes from living too long without the luxury of surprise. He set the parcels on the table, bread, dried pears, a small packet of herbs. He said the market was busy, that the river ice was beginning to crack. She asked if anyone had spoken to him of the night they met. He looked at her for a moment, weighing the worth of the truth, and then said yes. He added that the city always speaks, whether there is reason or not. The older child came to the table and looked at the packet of herbs. He asked what they were for. The man said for tea to keep the cold from settling too deep in the chest. He poured hot water from the kettle and let the scent fill the room. Sharp, clean, with a faint sweetness underneath. The younger child leaned into it, eyes half closing. After they ate, he stood by the window and watched the street. He asked if she had walked much beyond the market square since the cold began. She shook her head. He said he would take them to see the river once the sun was higher, if she agreed. She asked why. He said the river teaches a person two things: how to move and how to wait. They left the house together near midday, the cloak around the children again. The street took notice in its quiet way. Curtains shifted. A man sweeping his step paused to rest on the broom. She kept her eyes forward, but she felt a pattern of gazes as if they were hands brushing the edge of her shawl. At the river's edge, the ice stretched in plates, the water beneath moving in dark, slow channels. He stood with the children near the railing, pointing to a place where the current showed through. He spoke of how the ice will break first at the bends, how the sound carries through the city when it does. She listened, though her eyes were on the far bank where the warehouses stood in shadow. A pair of guards passed, one of them giving the man a nod. She caught the flicker of recognition, the small measure of respect. It made her wonder again who exactly he was, and why a man with that kind of standing had turned down a narrow lane on a winter night. When they walked back, the wind had shifted. Snow carried on it again, fine and dry. He drew the cloak tighter around the children and matched her pace exactly, neither urging her faster nor letting her slow. In the house, he hung the cloak by the door, then turned to her and said only, "It is better to be seen together than apart, for now." She did not answer, but the thought stayed with her through the rest of the afternoon, settling like the weight of the fur on the cloak, heavy, warm, and impossible to ignore. The snow began again before evening, sweeping in from the river in thin, slanted lines. The city muffled itself under the soundless fall. By the time they returned from the small courtyard, the windows were already edged with frost. He closed the shutters and set the bolt, as though sealing the house against more than just the cold. The fire in the hearth had burned to a low bed of coals. He knelt to add wood, moving each log as if it had a place already chosen. Flames rose in slow tongues, catching along the bark, turning the room gold in places and leaving others in shadow. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces reflecting the light in small, steady pulses. She took the shawl from the peg and wrapped it loosely around her shoulders. The warmth in the room was different from the kind found in markets or kitchens. It was not the warmth of bustle or of work. It was the steady, patient kind that fills the edges of a space until even the air seems to settle. On the table lay the day's work, the ledger closed, the linen folded, the needle tucked away. The bread he had brought from the market was cut into neat slices beside a plate of dried pears. He poured water into the kettle and set it close to the fire. The children leaned in, listening for the first small hiss. Outside, the wind shifted the shutters. The sound reminded her of the street they had left, the slow press of cold against stone, the way snow drifts into corners and stays until someone moves it. She sat at the far end of the table watching him. The firelight worked along the edges of his face, softening the lines carved there by time or work. When the kettle began to hum, he poured the water over the herbs he had shown the children that morning. The steam curled upward, carrying that same sharp, clean scent. He passed her a cup, waited until she took it, and then set another before the older child. The younger had already curled into a corner of the hearth rug, head resting on folded arms. The maid entered with a folded cloth and a small tin of salt. She laid the cloth over the bread to keep it warm and placed the salt near the pears without comment. Her eyes met the woman's for a moment, a quiet exchange without need of words, before she turned back to the kitchen. The door closed softly behind her. He sat at last, his chair angled toward the fire. They ate in silence, the kind that is not empty but full of small, unspoken allowances. He asked if she had walked the courtyard before today. She said no, that she had known of it only by sound, the laughter of children in warmer seasons, the creak of laundry lines in the wind. He told her the courtyard had been planted long ago with apple and quince, though only the apple had lasted the winters. In spring, the blossoms came all at once, so thick the air smelled of them for days. He said the stone bench near the wall stayed warm, even in early frost. His voice was calm, but the way he described it made the place feel nearer than the snow outside. The older child finished his bread and set the cup down carefully, as though the act itself might change the room. He moved to sit beside his mother, his head leaning slightly against her arm. She rested her hand on his hair without looking away from the fire. A log shifted, sending a flare of light up the chimney. He glanced at it, then back to her. "Some doors," he said, "once closed, are not meant to be opened again in haste." She knew he was not speaking only of wood and hinges. She did not ask what door he had in mind. Instead, she said, "And some need to be closed so the fire does not die." He gave a small nod, as if the answer was the right one, or at least one he could live with. The wind pressed against the shutters again, but the fire held its ground. The house felt more like itself in the stillness, the walls drawing in warmth the way cloth takes dye. She finished her tea, set the cup down, and listened to the children's breathing, one slow and deep, the other light and quick with dreams. He stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to look out. Snow fell without hurry, but without pause. He let the curtain fall back, then turned toward the hearth. "It will be worse by morning," he said, "but here it will hold." She believed him, though she did not know if he meant the weather or the place they had found themselves in. Before the night settled fully, he added another log to the fire, then one more. The coals glowed as though they could last through anything. The room held its warmth, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt the weight in her chest shift. Not gone, but changed, like ice breaking just enough for water to move beneath it. By the next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. The courtyard lay under a thin crust of ice where the sun had touched it the day before. She stepped outside with the children while he was in the front room, speaking with the maid over a folded note. The cold bit quickly at their cheeks, but the stillness felt welcome, a space apart from the close rooms of the house. The older child traced a slow line in the snow with his boot. The younger held her hand, staring at the branches above the wall where a sparrow moved in quick darts. She drew her shawl tighter, the fabric now holding the faint scent of smoke from the hearth. In the far corner of the courtyard, beneath the arch, two voices carried softly from the street. She could not hear words, but she knew the rhythm, the pause and lean of conversation meant to be overheard only in part. The children played near the bench while she walked the perimeter. The high walls caught the morning light in patches, revealing places where ivy had died back in the frost. At one spot, low to the ground, the mortar between stones had worn thin. She crouched, running her fingers along the uneven surface. It was a small thing, but she had learned to notice such details. In the streets, knowledge of where the wall bends or the step cracks can be the difference between slipping away unseen and being found. When they returned inside, the man was waiting by the hearth. He had a folded letter in one hand and a small leather pouch in the other. He said the letter would go to the baker in the North Quarter, the one who owed him a favor, and that the pouch was coin enough for bread, flour, and oil. He looked at her a moment longer before adding that it was also enough to pay for silence, should silence ever need buying. The words caught her off guard. She asked if there was a reason silence might need to be bought. He said the city had ears in every alley, and some preferred to hear what is useful to them. Not all attention could be turned away with kindness. Some required weight, and coin had weight when nothing else would serve. That afternoon, she saw the truth of it. The maid returned from market with her cheeks flushed from cold and eyes sharpened by what she had heard. In the square, two women had been speaking of the man in the fur cloak who had brought strangers into his house. One said it was charity, the other called it something less clean. Neither used names, but both knew the street and the door. The man listened without surprise when the maid told him. He only asked which way the talk was traveling, toward the guards or toward the merchants. She said the merchants for now. He nodded and returned to the ledger on the table, writing in the day's expenses as if nothing had shifted. Later, while the children napped, she stood in the front room and watched the light fade from the courtyard. She thought of the broken mortar in the wall, of the sparrow moving between bare branches, of the sound of voices meant to be half heard. She wondered if the house was a shield or a trap, and whether she would know the difference before it mattered. When he joined her at the window, he said only, "Shadows come from light. They tell you where it is, but not whether you should step into it." She did not answer. Outside, the sparrow settled in a high branch, its shape a small dark mark against the pale winter sky. The day began with a low sky, the kind that promised snow but held it back, keeping the air heavy and close. The city felt slower beneath it, as if waiting for something to begin. In the main room, the fire burned in a steady low glow, its light catching on the brass latch of the front door. She sat at the table with the ledger closed, a clean sheet of paper before her, the ink well set just to her right. The children were upstairs with the maid, their voices rising and falling in gentle play, far enough away to feel safe. She had not written a letter in months. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of every word she had left unsent. She touched the edge with her fingertips before dipping the pen. There was no greeting, no address. She began in the middle, as if the letter was part of a conversation that had been waiting inside her since the night they arrived. She wrote of the cold that made time stretch thin, of the streets emptied by frost, of the narrow lane and the circle of lantern light. She described the open hand, the heavy cloak, the fire that had greeted them. She wrote that the children now slept in a bed with walls on every side, that they ate bread without measuring each slice, that their cheeks had lost the deep hollows of wind. But she did not write his name. She did not write her own. The letter was not meant to explain everything. It was meant to mark that they were still here, still living in the pause between leaving one place and finding another. The man came in quietly, his coat damp from the air outside. He placed a small package of apples on the table. His eyes went to the page, then to her face, but he asked no questions about the words. "Letter," he said, "travel faster than people think. Sometimes they reach the wrong ears before they find the right hands." His tone was even, but it left the air between them heavier. She set the pen down, though the ink was still fresh on the nib. A knock came at the front door. He crossed the room and opened it just enough to stand in the narrow gap. She could hear the low murmur of a voice, then his own, slower, measured. When he closed the door again, his face had not changed, but something in the stillness of his eyes told her the conversation had been more than casual. He said a merchant had been asking questions, polite ones but too specific. Who she was, how long she had been in the house, where the children's father might be found. Her hand went to the letter without thinking, folding it once, then again, until the edges pressed into her palm. "And what answer did you give?" she asked. He shook his head. "Sometimes the safest answer is none at all. The city is always listening, even when it looks away. Manam." The younger child came down the stairs carrying a wooden button he had found in the corner of the landing. He placed it in her palm and waited for her to make it part of the small counting game they played. She did, letting the rhythm of it steady her, though the folded paper still rested in her other hand. The older child followed, leaning against her side, his eyes drawn to the fire. Afternoon drifted into evening. The sky outside had gone from iron to deep blue, but the snow still had not begun. The silence of it felt heavier than the storm itself. She stood by the window for a time, watching the courtyard walls catch the last light. Somewhere beyond, she imagined the merchant speaking again, passing her description along, changing details until they no longer belonged to her, but still carried her shadow. After the children had been put to bed, she returned to the table. The letter lay there, edges soft from being held too long. She did not seal it. She did not tear it. Instead, she placed it in the drawer beneath the ledger, where it could wait without being seen. The fire had burned low, throwing long shadows into the corners of the room. He passed behind her, pausing just long enough for his gaze to fall on the drawer, then on her. Neither spoke. The air between them held the unspoken agreement that some things, once sent into the world, cannot be called back. Upstairs, the children shifted in their sleep. Outside, the city kept its questions in the dark, waiting for the moment they might be useful. When she went to bed that night, she thought not of the words she had written, but of the ones she had left out. The names, the places, the promises. In the dark, the letter seemed to hum faintly from its place in the drawer, as if aware that its time might come, or might never come at all. Snow began falling in the early hours, soft enough that it seemed more like a drifting of breath than weather. By dawn, the courtyard was a blank sheet, unmarked by prints or shadow. The air had that still quality that only follows a deep, steady fall, as if sound itself had chosen to rest. She stood in the kitchen doorway, shawl wrapped close, the scent of ash and bread from the hearth behind her. The snow fell past the lintel in slow tilts, flakes catching the faint morning light before vanishing into the white ground. She watched until her eyes softened into the scene, no longer counting what was moving or still. The children were already outside. Their boots pressed narrow tracks into the unbroken surface, lines that curved toward the bench near the far wall. The older child led the younger with a hand to the shoulder, careful not to rush, careful not to let him slip. They traced shapes in the frost with gloved fingers, circles, crooked stars, something that might have been a bird or a flower. Their laughter came in small bursts, then faded into the deep quiet the snow seemed to hold over the house. She let them play, stepping out just far enough to hear their voices without the muffling of the door. Her boots sank slightly into the crust, leaving half-moons in the powder. The air was sharp on her cheeks, but it was the kind of cold that keeps a person awake, not the kind that takes the strength from them. She stood there until the younger child looked up, his breath making a cloud in the space between them. "It's softer than yesterday," he said, as if the snow had moods. She nodded. "Some days it falls to cover, and some days it falls to keep." Inside, the fire burned higher than usual. The man sat at the table, ledger open, pen moving in calm lines. His notes were steady, wood used, flour purchased, candles counted. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment their eyes held without words. It wasn't silence born of absence, but of something shared, the recognition of a season that was not yet ready to let them go. The children came in soon after, cheeks flushed, hair damp with melting flakes. They left their boots by the door, the older helping the younger to set them side by side. The man pushed bowls of soup toward them, steam rising into the space between. Barley, herbs, a faint note of onion, the kind of food that keeps the body warm longer than the moment it's eaten. They ate without hurry. She did too, tasting the way the broth carried the scent of the wood that had heated it. By mid-afternoon, the city had pulled in on itself. The snow muffled footsteps, softened the edges of walls, blurred the lines of roofs and chimneys. From the window, the street was more shape than detail, figures passing as shadows against a pale sky. She sat in the chair by the glass, her shawl drawn close, watching the slow drift of white against the high courtyard wall. The mortar she had touched days before was hidden now, the small gap sealed by ice. The sparrow's branch was bowed low, the bird nowhere in sight. She wondered about walls, how they are built to keep things out, but also to keep things in. whether the one around this courtyard was more protection or confinement. She had lived long enough to know that a wall could be both, and that the difference often lay in the direction a person wished to go. When the light began to thin toward evening, lanterns along the street flickered into small circles, their glow softened by the fall of snow. She climbed the narrow stairs to the upper window. From there she could see past the courtyard to the lane where they had first stood. Coins on the stone, wind biting through the shawl, the slow approach of the man in the fur cloak. The image came to her as if from another life, one she could reach in only a few steps, and yet one sealed away by something heavier than walls or weather. The sound of his steps came behind her before she saw him. He joined her at the window, his shoulder brushing hers, the fur collar carrying the faint cold of the outer hall. They looked down together at the lane, both quiet. He didn't speak of the questions still moving through the market, of the merchant's polite but pointed inquiries, of the letter folded and hidden in the drawer. Instead, he said, "Snow remembers where it has fallen. Even when it melts, the ground knows." They stayed there for a time, watching the slow turn of flakes in the lantern light. Then he stepped back, leaving her to the view. She traced the lines of the lane with her eyes, marking where the light touched and where it left shadow. She thought of the footsteps that had crossed it, theirs, his, others she did not know. She thought of how snow hides such marks, but never erases them from the memory of the stone. Later, when the children were asleep, she stood again at the window in the main room. The fire was low now, its glow folded into the coals. Outside, the street was still, save for one figure moving quickly, head bent against the cold. She imagined that same figure passing the lane, glancing toward the doorway, wondering, as others might, what had changed behind it since the snow began to fall. The next morning, the sun would rise on a city remade in light. The snow would glare white on rooftops, the streets crisp and new. People would walk, speak, trade, as though the world had always been this quiet. But she knew better. Under the snow, the stones still held the memory of steps, theirs among them, and somewhere beyond the market, beyond the frozen river, there were still voices asking questions. Perhaps they always would. For now the house was warm. The children slept with the slow breathing of safety. The fire gave enough light to hold the corners of the room, and in the courtyard, the snow lay in perfect stillness, keeping the shape of the day as if it might choose never to let it go.